Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series on preparing for admissions assessments. Today we're going to be focusing on the arts admissions assessments. So this will be archaeology, architecture, and history of art. And this also applies to design students who will be taking the architecture admissions assessment this year. So my name's Natalie, and I'm the school's liaison officer at Magdalene College in Cambridge, so one of the colleges that makes up the University of Cambridge. This webinar will be applicable no matter which college you are applying to. It's just Magdalene that's delivering the session. So don't worry if you're applying to a different college, that's absolutely fine. So we're going to go through in this session some advice on preparing for the different assessments, what they're going to involve, how you can get yourself familiar with the format of the assessment, and some tips and tricks for preparing and what to do on the day. So we'll probably take about 30 minutes for the main session, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions if you have them. So to get started, the first thing to cover is why do we use admissions assessments? So competition for a place at Cambridge is really, really high. As you can expect, there are lots of applicants after these places for all the different courses that we offer. And almost all of our applicants have really fantastic academic records. They've done really well on their GCSEs. They're expected to achieve really highly at A-level or any other qualifications that they're doing. And so the point of admissions assessments is allowing us to assess two different skills that perhaps don't come through in your academic career in school. So these are skills that are going to be really useful for your chosen course, whatever that is, and some subject-specific knowledge. Now, the level of subject-specific knowledge we expect from your assessment varies depending on the course. So for things like history of art, we don't expect a lot of background knowledge because it'll be a new subject for you, but some evidence of your interest and your enthusiasm and your aptitude for the sorts of skills you might use during that course is really useful for us. The second point is how we use admissions assessments. So on this slide, you can see a diagram of all the different parts of the application that we see when you apply to Cambridge. So this includes your academic record, so how you did at GCSE and what your teachers think you'll get in your A-levels. It includes your personal statement that you write in your UCAS application and your teacher reference that accompanies that. We also see your scores and your essays from your admissions assessments, so another useful part of the application process. Any written work that you're asked to do, if this applies to your subject, it doesn't for all of them. And if you're invited to interview, we also see a report on how you did in your interviews and a score for that as well. So all this gets put together to make a decision on your application. The really, really important point here is that no part of your application is considered in isolation. So everything that gets put together to make a decision about you, nothing is more important than anything else, and nothing is the be-all and end-all. So if you feel like you didn't do particularly well in one of your interviews, or you perhaps dropped a few marks on the admissions assessment, that's absolutely fine, and it can balance out by a stronger performance in one of the other elements of this application process. The other point on this slide is that there is usually no pass mark for any of the assessments. So what that means is, although the assessments are marked and you'll be given a score, which is visible to the admissions tutors at the college you're applying to, there isn't a set pass mark for any of these assessments. And so even if you don't score particularly well on the admissions assessment, you may still do a really good personal statement or do a really good interview performance, and that can still balance out. Admissions assessments are also not the defining factor in deciding who is invited to interview. So there isn't a pass mark to get you into the interview stage. That's not how it works at all. We use all the information we have about you together, and it's not anything in isolation. Hopefully that makes sense, but feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A box if you have them. So today we're going to focus on these three assessments, which are the archaeology, architecture, and history of art admissions assessments. So the first point to make you aware of, if you're not already, is that you do not need to register for these assessments. Whichever college you apply to, or whichever college you're assigned to, if you do an open application, will register you themselves. So you don't have to do it without them. They will provide you with all the information that you need on what you need to know before the assessment and how to find the assessment on the day. So look out for your emails once you applied to the college for more information about that. The 3 dates the assessments to make a note of if you don't know them already. Archaeology will take place on the 27th of November. Architecture, which includes those applying for design, will be the 24th of November, and history of art will be the 28th of November. And because the assessments are online, you can take them wherever you like, either at school or at home, wherever you have a quiet place to work. And you'll receive instructions about how to join the assessment and what to do with it and how to send it back from the college that you apply to slightly nearer the time. The first thing to get yourself familiar with is the format of the assessment. So all three assessments we're going to look at today involve some sort of writing task, usually based on some source material, whether that's the text or an image. So that is one skill to prepare for in advance of the assessment, no matter which one you're doing. Architecture is also a bit of a special case because it incorporates a drawing element. So I'll give you some specific advice for that later on, but you will also have a writing task, so the whole presentation will be useful. Looking firstly at the writing task that you're asked to do, I've got some examples here on the screen of previous writing tasks from each of the assessments. And you can see in some ways they're quite similar. So the archaeology example we have is, why might it be important for archaeologists to tell stories of ordinary people in the past? And this is based on some source material that you're given, so usually 1 or 2 extracts of text that you read, analyse and write about in answer to this question. Similarly, with architecture, although you don't have some source material here, you're asked quite a big abstract question that you're invited to share both your knowledge and your ideas and just your instincts about the question. This example is, how can architects help the environment? So you can see there's lots of different avenues you can go down there. You can be very creative with it, but it's asking for your ideas and your opinions. And the third example is from history of art, and this asks you to comment on 2 pairs of images of works of art. And that phrase comment is quite an interesting one because, again, it leaves it very open-ended. You can really take this question however you want it and write what you find interesting about the works of art you're presented with. And so really, really interesting questions and hopefully enjoyable for you. These are quite different to what you might be used to in your A-levels and in school, but they are quite interesting questions, and hopefully you'll find the assessment somewhat enjoyable. So as I said, these questions are similar in many ways. Most of them do involve working with source material, either texts or images. All of them ask you to create an argument supported by evidence. So thinking about your essay writing skills, if you're doing any essay-based A-levels, this might come more naturally, but if you're not, that's not a problem, and I'll go through some advice on that shortly. And all of them do require careful structuring and time management. The assessments are all to time, and so you will have a limited amount of time to complete the tasks, and you can find more information about how much time you're allocated for the assessment or for each question on the website for the course you want to apply for, including some more past papers or sample papers for you to have a look at. And you're also required to both structure your writing or structure how much time you're dedicating to writing and drawing if you're doing the architecture one. And so these are quite transferable skills that will be very useful both in your school and university career, as kind of time management and working out how long you have for each section. So I'm going to go through a couple of steps how I would advise preparing for any of these assessments. As I said, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box as we're going along. The first step, I think, is definitely to familiarise yourself with what you'll be expected to do on the assessment day. So thinking about how many questions you have to answer, do you have a choice or a choice of questions or a choice of passages to answer questions on? What is the format of the questions? Are you being asked to compare different sources of text or compare images? Are you being asked to respond to a passage or a piece of writing or an image? And how much of your own knowledge is required? So if you're not being asked to write about a piece of text or some writing, how much background knowledge is expected of you and how many things you should read or familiarise yourself with to be able to answer some of these questions with a little bit of background knowledge, even if you haven't studied that subject at school before. So this is kind of at the first stage. You're going to be more reassured and more calm about the assessment if you know what you're getting yourself in for and you know what to expect. And this will help you move on to the actual preparation where you can look into example questions and practice doing some past papers if you find that useful. The second stage, therefore, is to identify which skills are being tested. So is it comparing and contrasting, looking at different pieces of source material, whether that's writing or images? Are you being asked to select evidence from a text to write about? If you're responding to an extract, are you being asked to draw examples from that or use it as inspiration? Are you being asked to formulate an argument, comparing different points of view and then coming to a conclusion based on your opinions? Is it testing your reading comprehension? How much of the extract you get to understand and to interpret in the writing that follows? And in every single one of them, but really important to remember, you need to address the question directly. This is definitely a skill they're testing you on, is how closely can you respond to the question and give a direct answer to what it's asking you. So if you're responding to, for instance, the architecture example question that's quite open-ended and quite broad, if you go off on a tangent and don't end up answering the question, that's going to mark you down because you haven't directly addressed the question, and that is one of the skills that you're being tested on. So making sure at the end of every sentence, every paragraph, making sure that you're reminding yourself, does this answer the question, or is this getting my point across in response to the question? Really important things to think about here. So these are all slightly different for the assessments that you're doing. We've grouped these together because they have a lot of similar skills, but they do have different specifications. So what you're expected to know and do for the assessment. This information in the specification is available for each of the assessments that you're doing on the Cambridge course page for your course you're applying to. If you look under entry requirements on that page, there'll be several different sample papers or bits of information about the assessment that you can have a look at. That's very specific to your assessment, so to tell you everything you want to know on that front. The third stage, now we've kind of got through the familiarization parts, we want to practice these key skills that we've identified that will be useful for your assessment. So whichever assessment you're doing, it has a writing task to it. And so I'd really recommend practicing planning some short essays, either using the past papers or perhaps using some example sources. So this can be really up to you and what you find useful. But the style of essay that you'd be asked to write in the admissions assessment is quite often a bit shorter than you might be used to in some of your A-levels. Perhaps if you're doing A-level English or history, the essays are often a little bit longer and you have lots to write about, whereas the short essays that you have time for in the admissions assessment can be a little bit of a surprise and not really what you're used to. So having a look at some past paper questions or the questions from the sample papers that are on the course page website, that'll give you an indication of what sorts of questions could be asked and how long you will have to answer them. And planning is really important because it gives you an idea of how much you have chance to write in that short time that you're given. So if you're given 30 minutes to write this really short essay, thinking about how long it will take you to read any source material provided with, to plan the essay when you're given it, and to write the introduction, the basic paragraphs, and the conclusion. So taking time for that and realizing that you definitely can't fit everything in that short time. Whereas if you're writing a longer piece of coursework or an exam essay where you're given more time to write it, you might have lots of different points to present and do quite a few different paragraphs. Quite often in these quite short time frames, you just don't have time for that. And so it's a real skill to practice planning and perhaps writing, if you find it useful, these short, concise paragraphs that really get your point across and answer the question clearly in a short space of time. If you have done the past papers or there aren't enough for you on the website, then you can have a look at some example sources that are perhaps similar to the ones that you're given on the website. You can ask your teachers to help you with this if they can do. So for instance, if you're doing the archaeology assessment and you've had a look at the past papers and the different sources that you're provided with, but they aren't quite enough and you want to do some more practice, perhaps asking a history teacher at school or someone similar, if your school offers classics, for instance, something from a similar subject, they can perhaps find you some example sources from their knowledge and from their knowledge of the wider literature on that subject. And so they can help you with some more example sources to work from and kind of make up questions for you. Equally, once you've had a look at a few of the past papers, you can make up questions for yourself. You can see what sort of things come up fairly regularly or what sort of topics you might want to know more about. And practice doing some planning and writing based on that information. Another skill here is practicing writing concisely. As I mentioned, you won't have much time to present your argument. So this applies to both your sentence structure and your paragraphs. So if you're someone, so like me, I write quite lengthy and quite wordy, like to use a lot of different descriptions in my writing. You don't always have time for that in these really short essays that you're asked to write. And so if you can make sure that every sentence you're writing is quite short, to the point, you're focusing on the facts or what you want to get across, then that'll serve you really well and you're able to have time to write more things. That doesn't mean you have to change your entire writing style. It's just making sure that you're not going off on those tangents that can be really tempting to go off down when you're really fascinated by the subject. So making sure that you're being concise, you're to the point, and you're responding directly to the question. And finally, for this list is trying to find some wider reading that could help your background knowledge. So as I said, depending on which assessment you're doing, the level of expected knowledge is slightly different. And so have a look at the specifications for whether they expect you to have some background knowledge or just demonstrate an interest in the subject, which is more common for most of these courses. But it can be really helpful to demonstrate your interest is by having a look at some wider reading that can help you if the question correlates to any of those topics. So for instance, in the example on this slide, if the question is, how can architects help the environment? You can see there that the environment and the ethics of buildings is a theme that could come up in these assessments. So doing a little bit of reading on those sorts of topics, and that will really help you if that sort of question comes up, and you can make some links based on your background knowledge. As I said, you're not expected to have a huge map knowledge in this area. You're going to university to learn how to do the course and the subject, not to know everything from day one. And it really doesn't matter if the question surprises you or isn't related to one of these topics, but it really can help to reassure you that you do have some knowledge and some interest in the subject if you have a little bit wider reading that I'm sure you've been doing already in preparation for your personal statement and that sort of thing. But it's really helpful just to have a look at a few different topics and some contemporary issues in the subjects in preparation for the assessment. Similarly, for the archaeology example here, if you can have a look at some contemporary writing about archaeology and the links between anthropology and telling the stories of people, that could be interesting, and there's lots of literature on that to have a look at. But equally, if the question is something completely different, that's absolutely fine. The questions are designed to be quite unfamiliar to most candidates, and so no one's at too much of an advantage. But having a wide reading base and a background knowledge in a few different areas can help you if you can make any of those links to your background knowledge with whatever question comes up. So just going back to this slide. So searching for things like contemporary issues in architecture can really give you an idea about what sort of themes are going on in that world at the moment and what writers of this subject are currently writing about, people, academics at different universities or researchers, what sort of things are they writing about at the moment, what's kind of trendy in these areas, and that can help you think about what sort of themes could come up. And step 4 is really editing. So after you've finished doing a past paper question or looking through a sample paper and practicing planning or writing the essays, I recommend kind of asking yourself, firstly, have you addressed what the question is asking? I've said it before, but I will say it again, you are being tested on your ability to respond directly to the question. And so it's really, really important that you bear that in mind all the way through when you're checking through your work. And I would recommend leaving time at the end to check through your work, checking that you've addressed what the question is asking and making sure you responded to it really directly. Secondly, have you drawn examples from the text if that's required? If the assessment says you need to draw examples from the text to support your argument, then have you done that? Have you responded to the requirements of the question and what you're being asked to do in the assessment? This doesn't mean quoting lots of the text, but it can mean referring to what the author is arguing or what the piece of writing says in a certain section to demonstrate why you're saying what you are in your own work. Thirdly, is your writing structured logically and coherently? Again, this links back to responding to the question and not going off on too many tangents, making sure that you've got a clear introduction. It can be quite short, but it clearly introduces what you're going to say in the rest of your writing. Perhaps one or two body paragraphs to be the bulk of your argument, getting your point across, perhaps bringing in some alternative points of view, and then ending it with a conclusion that clearly rounds up. And so everything is quite coherent, it's structured very logically, and so the reader knows where you're going next with your argument and can follow it quite clearly, and it doesn't go off on a tangent that doesn't respond to the question. Similarly to this, have you presented a substantiated argument? So substantiated meaning that you have evidence to back up your points and there is reasoning behind the opinions you're giving. So thinking about every point that you're making, are you giving evidence from it? Are you linking it to either your background knowledge or to the source material you've been given? And does the reader believe what you're saying? Are you arguing based on some knowledge or some facts or some evidence from the sources? And finally, as we've said, is your writing clear and concise? Have you managed to get in everything you want to say in that short time period? And have you kept it really clear so the reader knows what you're trying to say? So a few examples of questions that you can really just use to ask yourself in that editing process and make sure your writing is as good as it can be. I would really recommend leaving some time at the end of your writing session to edit and to check through your work. Doesn't have to be more than about 5 minutes, but it can really help get you those few extra marks if your writing is really clear and substantiated points are being made, because those are the skills you're being tested on. And so spending those extra 5 minutes just checking it over can be really helpful. And then step 5, preparing for the actual day of the assessment. If you're doing a lot of past papers, you might not be doing them on timed conditions necessarily. And this is really different to doing it under the time conditions when you're limited to that strict time limit and exam structure. So remember that each assessment does have their own time limit, and you can remind yourself of this on the course page's websites. So thinking, how much time can you spend on each question? If you are one of the assessments that has multiple questions to them or different parts of the assessment, can you make sure that you can spend a roughly even amount of time on each question, or that your time spent correlates to the amount of marks available for that question if it's shown on the test? How much time can you spend reading, planning, and checking? So remember, if you are one of the assessments that has some source material as part of the question, you'll need some time to read through that before you start responding to the question, some time to plan your work, to write it, and check it afterwards. So everyone has different ways of doing this. Some people read faster than others. Some people like to do a really thorough and detailed plan, and some like to jot a few notes down before they start writing. Whatever works best for you, and try it a few different ways beforehand if you can, to see what does best. But making sure that you're leaving time for all these different things in your assessment is really important. And thinking about how you can structure your work as well. If it is an essay or a comment piece, thinking about how you're going to structure it with that introduction, with that conclusion. Do you have to include points from different points of view and different people's arguments, and thinking about how you're going to plan your work ready for that. I would recommend trying a past paper under time conditions if you can, or if you've already done the past paper, then asking a teacher or someone else, or just yourself making up some questions that are quite similar for you to answer. I really would say don't worry if you struggle to keep time on your first attempt. This is why I recommend practicing. A lot of applicants will struggle to keep to the tight time limits in their first attempt. But this is why we practice, and we keep doing a few different ones to get used to the time limits. And once you've done it a couple of times, I'm sure you'll get used to it. And then finally, just for those who are doing architecture or applying for design, you will also have a drawing task. So this is the text that's copied from the specification for the architecture assessment. It says, we are not looking for the display of any particular technical or formal skills. We are interested to assess the candidate's ability to think in a visual and spatial manner, to record spatial impressions, to demonstrate an awareness of their environment, and to interpret their environment in visual terms. So this is really helpful because it shows us exactly what they're looking for. In every specification for these different assessments, you are told exactly what sort of things they're looking for and what they're testing you on. So here, they're clearly saying that it really doesn't matter what sort of artistic training you've had, if any. Architecture applicants come from a whole range of backgrounds and have a whole different range of kind of artistic styles, and that's absolutely fine. That's what makes it a really fun and diverse course. And so what they're testing you on is, as it says, your ability to think in a visual and spatial manner. So be quite creative to draw what they can see or what they're thinking and to get it down on paper. So it's a very different skill to your essay writing, but one that will also be necessary if you're applying for these architecture and design courses. And so how you can prepare for this aspect of the assessment is really thinking about just practicing your drawing skills in any way you can, whatever style comes naturally to you. You probably will be doing quite a lot of drawing as part of any qualifications you're doing or just as a hobby, and that's really good. You'll also be asked to do a portfolio for architecture if you're invited to interview, and so preparing for that can also help with some drawing skills and get some practice in there. This is a very kind of traditional drawing task, and you're asked to do it on just pencil and paper. And so if that's not your usual style, then practicing with that can be really helpful. And they're asking you to demonstrate an awareness of your environment, which is quite an interesting phrase. And so thinking about wherever you are at any given moment, could you draw what you see and how would you record that? Can you explain it from a different perspective in the form of your drawing, perhaps, and be quite creative with that? And so it's really a skill that comes to you in whatever style you are used to doing your art in. But with this task, I'd really recommend just practicing drawing as much as you can and in whatever style you are used to, bearing in mind the limitations of the assessment. You will usually have around an equal amount of time for the drawing and the writing tasks to try and prepare at roughly equal amounts. And just remember, really importantly, that we're not expecting a perfect finished product in this very short time frame. It's very easy if you are an artist or you're used to creating this sort of thing to be a perfectionist and to be used to spending hours and hours poring over your piece of art. And that's great. And I'm sure you'll do that as part of the course wherever you end up. However, in this instance, we're just testing what you can do in a very short time frame. So please don't worry if you don't feel like it's your best work. It's almost certainly not going to be, and that's fine. You've got a very limited time frame, and so we just want you to do the best you can in that time. For whichever assessment that you're taking, we would really recommend that you don't pay for any preparation materials. You might see a lot of websites or companies out there who are offering very expensive courses on how to prepare for admissions tests, but really they're not necessary and they're not very helpful. The assessments website provides lots of logistical information about what the assessments involve, as I've gone through in this presentation, as well as all the practice papers and specifications that you'll need to help you out. So there is nothing that the paid materials will provide you that isn't already freely available on the websites. And so I would recommend avoiding those where you can. And similarly, you don't need to spend a huge amount of time preparing for the assessments. Hopefully you can see, as I've gone through today, there are a couple of quite quick stages you can go through to firstly familiarize yourself with the assessment, then secondly, identify the key skills you might be asked to demonstrate in the assessment, thirdly, to practice those skills, and finally, to get yourself prepared for how that fits into the time frame of the assessment. This doesn't need to take a huge amount of time. Please remember that you also have your UCAS application if you haven't quite done that off yet to prepare for. You will have your A-levels or your qualifications that you're currently doing. Those are also equally important and will be the deciding factor ultimately as to whether you meet the conditions of any offers you're given from universities. And so please don't let those slip while you're spending too much time on admissions assessments. You've most likely developed your critical thinking and essay writing skills during your GCSEs and A-levels, including your artistic skills if you're applying for architecture. And so getting familiar with the format of the assessment, trying out some practice questions under time conditions will be absolutely enough. So please don't worry about spending loads and loads of time preparing the assessments. It doesn't require that much preparation. Just a little bit of familiarity and practice will be absolutely fine. And finally, these assessments are designed to be challenging. As I said at the start, the assessments are designed to differentiate all these different brilliant candidates that we get for all our courses who have fantastic academic records. So they're designed to be challenging. It's absolutely fine if you find them difficult or you're quite struggling to get used to the skills being tested. Just focus on doing the best that you can in the time permitted and you'll be absolutely fine. And finally, please don't panic if you don't think you formed very well. It's very easy to misjudge how you performed in the assessments because you're not used to the mark scheme or how the admissions tutors are looking at your assessment. The assessment is just one part of the application process, as I said at the beginning. Your personal statement, your references, any contextual data about you as an applicant, and your interview performance, if you're invited, will also be considered. So it's not the be all and end all. A lot of candidates think they performed really, really badly and then didn't, and that's not the case at all. And so just make sure that you're preparing as much as you feel is necessary to do the assessment and then try to forget about it. You don't need to keep going over your performance and analysing what you could have done better because it's over at that point. So just don't panic if you don't think you performed very well, because chances are you've done better than you think, or it won't matter as much anyway. So hopefully reassuring note to end on. So on that, I'm going to open it up to questions. If you have anything that you'd like to know that we haven't covered yet, or anything that has kind of sparked your interest throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, which you should be able to see on your screens. I'll give you a couple of minutes to type in any questions that you have, and then I'll round up. We've got one question which says, you mentioned that we complete the assessment at school or at home. How does the assessment work if we complete it at home? Really good question. So the assessment can be sat at school or at home because you complete it through an online system, which Cambridge organises for you. And so they give you a set time on the date to complete the assessment, and you log into the online system either from school or home to complete it. And so it doesn't matter where you are as long as you've got a quiet space to work, and you either type your answers and send them through to the system, or if you're doing the drawing task, you can take a picture of your drawing and send that through via the upload system on the online platform as well. So it's super simple. We've been doing it for a few years now since COVID this way, and it works really well. So it doesn't matter where you are, you get the same experience either way. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, I think that's all the questions we've got for today. So thank you so much for joining. I hope this was useful, and of course, best of luck for your assessments. A quick reminder that we will also have another webinar on interview tips that will take place in November. So hopefully you've already signed up for that through the link you used to sign up for this webinar. And if not, I will send a reminder when I send out the recording of this webinar as well, so you can sign up again then. And so thank you so much for being here and for your questions. Best of luck for your assessments. If you have any further questions, my contact details are on the screen, so feel free to ask. But otherwise, have a lovely rest of your evening.